Great, well, thanks, Sammy. And it's great to be here and to see you all, so thanks for coming. You'll hopefully be pleased to know I'm not going to talk for very long, because what I'd really like to do is do Q&A, discussion, whatever it is that you want to do. If, and I think it's quite unlikely, you don't come up with any questions to ask, then I'll keep talking. So that is a threat rather than a promise. But just to say a little bit about myself first, I grew up here in Cambridge. I'm not a proper Cambridge boy because I came here when I was 3 months old, so I missed that key bit about being born here. But I've been here pretty much ever since, which has really given me a great insight into all of Cambridge. I also studied here at the University of Cambridge. I didn't manage to study here at Hills Road, which still annoys me because lots of my friends were here. They didn't take me, which is an issue. I'll happily tell you why if you want to know, but definitely a frustration. But I spent a lot of time hanging around here for various reasons. Not a whole lot of things. I was an academic, which does make me quite rare. I'm one of 2 people with a science PhD in the House of Commons. And there is a real issue there because when it comes to things like climate change, when it comes to things like drugs policy, actually having some idea of what the evidence is and what that means is kind of useful. So it's a bit of a lonely space there. Again, happy to talk about any of these things in more detail. I'm just going through fairly quickly. But then did get elected in 2010, so very exciting time. And it's been a really interesting and challenging time. Being the minor party in a coalition is a pain. Working with Tories is not something I would ever want to do. I'd say the same about working with Labour, or in fact most of the other people in Parliament. Actually, that's not fair. When you take the cameras off, we all get on quite well. Not all of us, there's a few people who are prats, but basically most MPs from all parties will get on quite well on a range of issues when you take the cameras away. So there's a number of Tories, a number of Labour people, Caroline Lucas from the Greens I've worked with quite a lot, where we can actually do things together. But it's been a really challenging time to be in that coalition. You know some of what's happened there. We've had some good things, there's been some bad things, exacerbated by the fact that there was no money left. I'm not going to get into the argument unless you want me to about whose fault it is that there was no money left at the end of the last government. There are obviously various stories about it. But what's very clear is that at the time of the last elections, for every £4 the government was spending, one of those was being borrowed. And what everybody agrees is you can't keep going like that. So we've managed to do some things to help people on very low incomes. We've done a whole range of other things, some things I disagree with. Tuition fees may come up with, something I stood firmly against. And there's a whole range of things that I've opposed because I just didn't agree with them. Something I think is quite important that you should want is an MP who will actually stand up for the people they represent, not just for their party. So I won't give you a full list of things I've opposed. They include Andrew Lansley's Health and Social Care Bill and military intervention in Syria and Iraq, as well as most recently voting against Trident. Again, things we can happily talk about. That's probably more than enough from me. Happy to talk about anything you would like to, and I presume somebody will tell me when I have to shut up. So over to you. Questions, be friendly, hostile, whatever you like. Yeah?
I've been seeing posters up around the college about the Lib Dems opposing the anti-gay laws in Commonwealth countries.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you would hope to achieve change.
Yeah, so this is, it is astonishing. In some ways it's astonishing that it's only in the 60s that it became legal to have gay sex in this country. The idea that we would make it a criminal offence is absolutely ridiculous. And something I'm very proud of in this country is that we managed to get same-sex marriage to happen. It's not properly equal marriage for a whole range of reasons, but it's a huge thing. I was very proud to play a part of that. We still have a lot further to go. But there are lots of other countries where it continues to be a criminal offence. Russia, for example, it's not a Commonwealth country, I'll come back to Commonwealth in a second, has just passed a law to say that people who are medically unwell can't drive a car. Now that sounds reasonable. We have laws here. If you have epileptic seizures, you can't drive a car. Their definition includes sexual issues such as being transvestite, transgender, bisexual or homosexual. And it's not obvious to me at all that being gay means you can't drive a car. I just don't see the link. Within the Commonwealth, though, we have a particular role because we have this club of countries. We have a particular link. The Queen is the monarch of many of the Commonwealth countries, though not all. And I think we should be prioritising making sure to that club of countries to say, look, part of being this club isn't just that we occupied you 80 years ago. It should also be that you have some basic standards of decency and human rights, which means, for example, making same-sex relationships legal and getting rid of all of that discrimination. So, for me, it's an important thing to do. There's lots of things where we should use our international efforts to try to tackle discrimination, whether it's violence against women and girls, female genital mutilation and things like that. We have to do it here as well. But we can't just say we'll fix what's happening here and ignore what's happening in places like Uganda, which treats people just atrociously. Okay?
So would it be a threat that if you don't revoke these laws, you will have to leave the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be quite happy to go that far, yes. You know, it seems to me you should not be in a club that we try and set the rules for if you break the rules of what we think is decent just so strongly. Really important factor for me. Anyone else? Yeah?
The Lib Dems have lost a lot of support over the last 5 years, and if you look at parties like Keith, they've gained a lot of support. How do you think over the next 5 years Lib Dems can gain back a lot of the support, especially from young people?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's been a tough time. I mean, being in government is much harder than not being in government. Making decisions is always harder. It's much easier to be the person saying, I'm sorry, somebody's gesticulating at me there, but so, you know, it was much easier to say I would do a better job than to actually have to do the job and make those decisions. So we lost support from a whole range of people simply for being in government. And if you look at the figures, it dropped off as soon as we were there. There are also other things. I mean, you know, the tuition fees was a disaster. You know, there's no doubt about that. It was awfully managed, awfully run, and that cost us quite a lot of support, particularly with young people. For what it's worth, I'm sure tuition fees will come up later. I voted against it. I'm quite proud to be the first MP for Cambridge ever to oppose a tuition fee increase. Because when Cambridge had a Labour MP, I was a student at the time, she had big headlines saying no fees here, and then voted to introduce tuition fees. And as we know, Labour then increased them. Labour then planned to, in fact, they had the Brown Review, which said there should be unlimited fees. But we completely messed it up, you know. I'm not going to try and defend that. So that's one of the reasons why we've lost support from young people. UKIP, by the way, have done very well by being a sort of plague on everybody's houses party. They have no idea what they stand for. Their policy on the NHS is somewhere between we should privatise the whole thing and have health insurance to it is fantastic and must always remain as it is. And they can't agree. You know, we have the leader saying one thing, the deputy leader saying the other thing, and their spokesman in the Commons with 3 different policies. You know, what they are, though, is a very toxic, nasty party that would be damaging for this country and send us back. They want to send us right back to the 50s and the sort of levels of discrimination and, you know, insight, you know, all the awful things that there could be there. It's a deeply xenophobic party. You know, not everybody, but they can't work it out. They're a very, very nasty group. But they've ridden this tide of anti-establishmentarians. The idea that Nigel Farage, who was a banker and then an MEP, managed to get people to believe he's the anti-establishment person is just ridiculous. So they're very toxic and dangerous. I don't support them, by the way, in case you hadn't worked that out. What do we do to try to build back some relationship? Part of it is about trust. You know, there's no doubt that the tuition fees debacle did cost us a lot of trust. And we haven't managed, I think, to get across the excitement of what we stand for. We've told people a lot about what we've done to stop the Tories doing things. And there's a massive list of things, by the way. I mean, you know, one of the proposals from the Tories was to say that anybody under 25 couldn't get any housing benefit because you should just go back and live with your parents if you don't have a job. And I love the idea that everybody has a loving, stable family they can go back and live with. I like that world. It's just not this world. So we fought hard against that. We killed that off, and there's a long, 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 long list of things like that. But that's not very exciting. You know, stopping the Snoopers Charter, you know, stopping the idea that the state should be able to access information about every website you ever go to, everything you do on Facebook or Google. You know, it's great. It's really important. We're still fighting that one. But it's not exciting. We have to give that vision. That liberal idea, which is all about empowerment, because there's a big difference in philosophy between the different parties, what we're trying to achieve. And I don't think, have got that across to people. So to simplify somewhat, and you can ask the other parties to describe their own philosophies, the Tory view is essentially if we take controls away, people will be free to flourish. I would say part of the problem is people simply won't be able to if you take things away because they won't get the basic services that are needed to lift people up. Labour's view essentially is that the state should do things for people. That's the core of it. I mean, they're split in lots of ways, old Labour, new Labour, and so on. And that's, you know, I can see the argument, the state should do good things, but it shouldn't force people to do what the state wants them to do. And so Labour are a very authoritarian party, the party of identity cards, of 90-day detention without charge, of things like that. It's about controlling people. That's my big problem there. You know, I could talk about lots of other parties. The Lib Dem vision is about making sure that you are able to do what you want to do, you can do what you want to do, you can do what you want to do, that we enable people to do those things. And I don't mind if you want to do different things. That's fine, that's great. So the state's essential to provide things like education, to provide social security, so that you are able to do things. There's a bit at the beginning of our party constitution, there's a preamble, which I think is brilliant, by the way, but I would say that, which says the Liberal Democrats exist to build and safeguard a free, fair and open society in which no one shall be enslaved by poverty, ignorance or conformity. And actually for me, that's quite a powerful message. That what we're about is making sure that you can do things and that money doesn't stop you from doing things. Lack of money doesn't. That you're educated enough to be able to do what it is that you want to do. That we don't say you're gay, you're black, you're whatever, and hence stop you from doing things. That empowerment message is really important. So if we can get that vision across, I think we'll get people excited again. There's also a lot of policies that fit with it. You know, discounts on bus travel for under 21, so it's 2/3 off, so you can actually get around. Promoting cycling and walking. Putting money into sixth form colleges like this one. Getting rid of the VAT that sucks money away from here. There's a whole long list of things, and I can go through them if you want. But for me, it's that vision and excitement about what we're about. Hopefully it'll work. Anyone else? Yeah.
I wanted to know what Lib Dem's future were for tuition fees and how you prevent the disaster that was happening.
So, I mean, you know, I've opposed tuition fees my whole time. I was an undergrad when they came in under Labour. I was a PhD student when they were tripled under Labour. And I was very clear that I wouldn't support them. So, I mean, I hope that's quite clear. The challenge is what to do now, because scrapping fees costs a lot of money. And while I would love to say to you that what I would do is to scrap fees immediately after the election if I won, in all honesty, I do not know how I would find the cash to do that. I simply don't know where I would take the money away from to do it. If I did, I would. What I would say is if we could find some money, and this is very much what the party policy is, to reduce fees, rather than changing them from 9,000 to 6,000, which has been suggested, we would do something else. The reason I wouldn't do that, if you reduce the amount of fees from 9,000 to 6,000, you still have to pay back the same amount every month until you finish paying it. So it only helps people who are going to go on to earn lots of money. If you have to earn, I can't remember the exact figure, something like 45,000 on average over your career in order for that to make a difference. Well, you know, frankly, of all the people I want to help, it's not the people who are going to earn quite well. So what I would want to do is to provide much more money for people when they're actually students. Because when I talk to students, I talk to the NUS quite a lot about this, the big challenge is paying for things like accommodation, food, when you're a student. So what I'd like to do is to spend any money I could find on helping undergrads with that cost of living. That, to me, would be the priority. One of the other things that we've pushed for and actually finally won is there's a big issue that, because actually you can go and be an undergrad, you don't have to pay the fees back until later, and actually I don't like the 9,000 fees, but you pay less per month back than you did under the old Labour system. So, you know, you pay less money but for longer. But there's a big problem, and actually we're seeing people from poorer backgrounds able to go to university. We're seeing bigger numbers than ever before. I didn't think that would happen, but it's what's happened. But then people start trying to do postgraduate degrees, and for postgraduate degrees, the system has essentially been that you have to pay the money up front. And so we've just managed to introduce a system like tuition fees, where you have loans, so that you don't have to pay the 10 grand or even more up front, because that was stopping people from poorer backgrounds doing master's degrees. So it's a long answer, but I'd like to see much more support for the cost of living. And if I could find the cash, and that's not going to happen for a while, I'd love to get rid of fees completely. I think they're completely the wrong way to go. Does that help? Cool. Yeah.
I just wanted to know what you thought about current Liberal Democrat policy in relation to whether it's more classically liberal or progressively liberal.
Yeah, there's often this sort of split view about the huge distinction between these, and I've often been asked, you know, which side of this fence am I? I don't think there is that much of a fence. There are lots of different views within every party. I think we are much more a centre-left, socially liberal party. That's the majority line, and that to me is progressive. As I said often, actually after the last election, when people said, what was your desired coalition? I wanted there to be a progressive coalition. The problem was trying to find any progressive parties in the House of Commons. And so us plus the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland are very good. So, you know, we could work together, but that gives us 58 out of 650. It's been a bit of a challenge. So I think we're on that socially liberal side because it's about empowering people to do things. There are people like Jeremy Brown who are much more on the economically liberal side, the sort of German FDP style. Certainly not where I am. So, so you have to get that right balance. If you over-regulate things, then things fall apart. If you under-regulate things, then things go wrong and they hit the most vulnerable people. So it's trying to find that right balance. So it's the empowering state rather than the controlling state.
So what would be some examples of current policies that do kind of support that view that you think kind of sums up the Lib Dems?
Well, actually, one example. I mean, I was talking about, poverty, ignorance, and conformity. So on poverty, things like lifting poorly paid people up out of income tax. I mean, that is a really big thing. That it used to be that if you were earning £10,000 a year, which is a pretty tough amount to live on, you had to pay £700 of that in income tax. Now you pay nothing. And actually, that's a lot of money going to people who really need it. I mean, that's a big difference. So that's lifting people out of poverty, some of the things we're doing on living wage and a whole lot of other things as well. On ignorance, we are the only party that's committed to maintaining funding for the entirety of education, starting with the free 2-year-old stuff that we've got all the way up through sixth form. That hasn't happened under this government. We had a fight with the Tories. We protected schools up to 16, and they wouldn't go any further, and we now want to go further. The Tories would now cut massively. They've had to be quite well, in fact, I say they've been quite clear about that. They've had notes saying, please do not talk about education funding because nobody wants to know that we're going to cut it. And Labour haven't really said very much. They've opposed ideas of moving to a national fair funding formula, for example. So you may or may not know that schools in Cambridgeshire currently get the least per pupil of anywhere in the entire country. Did you know that? Yeah, some did. So we've been right at the bottom for about 30 years. It's £600 per pupil per year. So if you think about how much money wasn't spent on your class over your whole education, that's a huge amount of money. So I've been fighting since I was at school, and in the 1st of April, we're getting £23.2 million to fix it. So that commitment on poverty and the conformity thing, the stuff that we've done about same-sex marriages, about fighting a lot of discrimination against transgender people in particular, that whole collection of things that we've done, to make sure that people are free, I think fits very much for that. Somebody from this side? No. Yeah.
Just quickly on your point about underfunding in Cambridgeshire, I'd argue that it's actually quite fair because most of the state schools tend to perform quite well, and perhaps the funding should go towards those that aren't doing so well nationally instead of Hills, I believe, is one of the top state schools, so perhaps it shouldn't get as much funding as not so good schools.
Okay, I mean, it's rare to find people arguing for less funding for their own education, but my
point is that we should be trying to make education generally the same throughout the country in terms of standards.
So what I would agree with you is that we should have a fair formula that's been calculated properly. We should, I don't think that Cambridgeshire should necessarily get exactly the same as anywhere else. You should look at things like deprivation. You should look at a whole range of things. So Tower Hamlets should get more than us. I've no problem with that as an idea. But currently there is no formula which tries to calculate that properly across the country. We are at the bottom of the pile for funding, not because somebody's done an analysis and said, actually, because somewhere has to be bottom, that's fine. But because 30 years ago, when a woman called Baroness Blatch, who was a Tory, ran the county council, she had a low tax, low spend policy. And so we spent very little on schools then. And when it was then nationally controlled, funding was fixed to what you spent last year. So we get a very small amount of money because we got a very small amount of money last year because we got a very small amount the year before. And that's not a fair formula. So what I want is a national fair formula. And that means some places will get more than others because of the factors you talk about. What we see here is, yes, some of the schools do well. But if you look at the gap between how pupils from richer backgrounds and poorer backgrounds are doing, it's widening. It's actually quite bad in Cambridgeshire. And one of the reasons is that people from poorer backgrounds do rely more on the quality of the school, the extra resources it can give. There's a whole lot of stuff about how socioeconomic background affects you. But one of the graphs that really chills me is if you look at 2-year-olds and you measure their ability. And let's just assume for a minute you can do that in any sort of sensible way. I don't think if you look at that and you take the top quartile of people from the poorest quartile of backgrounds, and you look at the worst achieving quartile from the highest backgrounds, richest backgrounds, you find it's like that. By the time they're 5, that gap's gone. Because the socioeconomic factor is so strong that it outweighs any sort of innate ability. That's something we can't allow to happen. That gap has to be closed. Otherwise, we're condemning people to much weaker life chances by the time they're 5 because of the family background. That's not okay with me. So we have to close that. Okay? I've actually met the person behind you, but that's okay.
Yesterday, the broadcasters announced a new format of televised debates, which would include the Green Party as well as the Welsh and Scottish Nationalists, but exclude the DUP, who are the 4th largest party in the House of Commons. Do you feel that's the right format to be going on?
Look, I think the whole thing's become absurd. I think the Greens should definitely be in the debates. I think what we should have is 5-party debates, because there are really 5 parties that are standing across the country. And that's Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, Green and UKIP. Plaid and the SNP and the DUP are only standing in very specific areas. What I'd also have then is a Scottish debate between the leaders of all the Scottish parties, a Welsh debate between the leaders of the Welsh parties, and a Northern Irish debate. Because the thing is, none of you, almost certainly, will be able to vote SNP, Plaid or DUP. And most of the country can't. Whereas everywhere in the country, almost everywhere in the country, you can vote for the other 5. So I would have 5-party debates. The Greens definitely have a right to be there along with UKIP. I didn't particularly like the sort of segregated way. I think it's really ridiculous now the way they're trying to make sure that 2/3 of the party of the debates, 2 of the 3 debates, only have the 2 larger parties. At a time where the 2 parties together are polling less than they ever have done before, to try to reinforce this idea that you have the red side and the blue side, and there's just this pendulum that switches between the 2, strikes me as daft. Because, almost certainly we will not have a majority government. Those days, fortunately, are gone, where you just had that pendulum swing. So, but the Greens, yeah, definitely. I don't agree with everything they say. I do agree with some of the things. I say Caroline and I work together on lots of things. But, their voice should be there. Caroline, I get on very well. I shouldn't repeat all our private conversations because she'll get in trouble more than I will. But but having her voice in the House of Commons has been really helpful. So, I should take something from this side. Yeah.
What's your view on the West Lothian question? How it will be solved? Because with further Scottish devolution happening pretty much every few months now, and then also similar calls from the Welsh and the Irish, Northern Irish, properly, for also there to get similar powers to Scotland. Do you support English votes for English laws or a similar formula?
So it's a really tough one, and there's no neat answer to what you do. Because the problem is that some things are quite cross the line. Public health, for example, some of it's England only, some of it's the whole country. So you have people voting on half of a clause of a bill and not the other half. It just feels tricky. So I think the best model is a sort of a representative assembly for England, made up of MPs, in proportion to vote share, for example. I know that the Tories are quite keen on having their system, which basically says that Tories get to control things no matter how everyone else votes. I'm not wild about that as an option. Fair votes for English laws, yes. Tory votes for English laws, no. Which is why make it a representative thing. Because one of the problems we have in this country, and I hope we're going to begin to change it, is that people get power without getting the votes to back it up. Let me leave out the House of Lords, which is an absurdity in this time. But when we had Tony Blair's massive majorities, he got 36% of the vote. You should not get a massive majority to do anything you want with 36% of the vote. That means most people did not want you to do it. I don't think the Tories should write into law Tory control of the English agenda unless they can get half the votes in England. So we have to move somewhere. I think the other answer is to devolve much more. So I'm very keen on devolution to everywhere. I'm pushing for devolution to Greater Cambridge. Not of everything, there are some things where we can't do it. But I'd like to see much more power for us locally because we will make better decisions. One of the other things that is a big problem in this country is that we are incredibly centralised. So until a few years ago, if you wanted to put up a mirror at a traffic light, you've seen these mirrors so that drivers can see cyclists? Every single mirror had to be personally approved by the Secretary of State for Transport. Now, it took a long time to do that because he's quite busy doing high-speed railway lines. So we are massively centralised. We're the most centralised country in Europe other than Malta. And Malta at least has the excuse that it's tiny. So we have to do much, much more devolution. So to me, you should always pass powers down if you can. You can't pass everything down, but you should where you can, here and everywhere else. Can I come back to you if we run out of other questions, or we can chat later? Is that all right? Yeah. So, yeah.
What's the NHS, the Liberal Democrat policy for the NHS in supporting the ageing population?
Right, really good question. And actually, I was in a big debate about this on Wednesday. So, the position on the NHS is very simple. It needs a lot more cash. We've put more cash in each year, but not enough more cash. And this is part of the argument. So, we have an older population. We're also able to do more things than we ever have been before. And if you go back to the original debates when the NHS was being created, everybody was saying that healthcare will become cheaper every year because people will be healthier. That's just not what's happened, because now we can do stenting, we can treat things. 50 years ago people just died. Now we keep them alive, but that costs money. And I'm pleased that we keep them alive. So we've put more money in, but not enough more money. And Simon Stevens, the chief executive, has said you have to put £8 billion in by 2020. That there will be some efficiency savings. The NHS could be run better. I don't think anybody doubts that. But it needs £8 billion extra by 2020. So what we've done as a party, I'm one of the people writing our manifesto, by the way, so I'm quite involved with a lot of this, is say, fine, £8 billion it is then. And so our challenge has been, how do we find £8 billion in order to be able to do that? And we've managed to find all the money in order to do that, from increasing or getting rid of various tax exemptions that various people get, getting rid of some daft schemes. The money's all accounted for to get to the 8 billion. So for us, it's about, it has to be 8 billion. But you can't do less, from my perspective. We also want to try to change how some of it's done. So I oppose the Health and Social Care Act, which is the very controversial thing. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about privatisation of the NHS. The truth is, it was started under John Major's government. It massively increased during Labour. The figures are that in '97, private work brought into the NHS was £1.1 billion a year. By 2009-10, it was £7.5 billion a year. So it's shot up, and it's actually just continued at the same rate. I don't think it's right now. I don't think it was right then. So we have to try and fix that. One thing which we would do is allow areas, if they want to, if it makes sense for the health community there, to get rid of this whole commissioner-provider split and all the contracting and tendering, and just be a unitary health body that provides all the services. So if places want to do that, I think they should be able to do that. And we'll see if it works well. If it works well, everyone else will do it. If it doesn't work well, they won't. A couple of quick things as well on mental health is something I've been doing a lot of work about. Mental health has been under-supported since the NHS was founded and before that. And we need to change that. To give you an idea, when the last government quite rightly brought in waiting time targets to see nobody should have to wait for a long time for operations, they never brought in any targets for mental health. And so all the money got pulled away from mental health towards physical health. Beginning in April, because it's the new year, there will be targets for mental health care, because 1 in 4 of us will have serious mental health problems in our lifetimes. That's a large number of people in this room. And we can't simply pretend it's not going to happen. So we have to put a lot more support into mental health. The other thing about older people, here in Cambridgeshire, is we've got a new service that's going to unite physical, mental and community care for older people, again, starting in April. I'm delighted the tender for that was won by the NHS. And that should make services a lot cleaner. Because if you've ever tried to work, had an elderly relative going through the system, you'll know they tend to get passed from this organisation to that organisation to that organisation. If it's one thing, hopefully they can actually provide better service. So, again, I'll come back to you if there's... Is that all right? Sorry. Yeah.
Don't you find it kind of contradictory that you don't think that SNP should be in the televised debates when they can vote in the Commons for laws that impact England?
No, not really. No, I don't at all. I mean, firstly, if you want to take the sort of purist principle, we have all the House of Lords people. Nobody gets to vote for them. I think we should have the principle you vote for people who make the laws. But I think given that you don't have the chance to affect it, I wouldn't. I don't care that much. If there was a whole system and people wanted the SNP in, I wouldn't fight in a ditch to stop it. It just seems to me that it makes far more sense to have a Scottish debate. Because part of the thing is, the SNP do have, in fairness to them, a policy of not voting on things that only affect England. So when you have a panel discussion about education, you'll have us saying we will put more money into education, support it. You have the Tories trying desperately not to admit that they'd have to cut money because they want to savage public spending. We'd have Labour having to come up with whatever policy they come up with. And we'd have the SNP saying none of this is to do with us because we wouldn't vote on it. It's going to become a bit silly. So, Yeah, and if people who've already had a question can just keep their hands down for a bit, I'll try to come back to people.
Do you believe we should have a British Bill of Human Rights or follow the European Act of Human Rights?
I think we should stick to the European Convention on Human Rights. I think it is brilliant. I have no problem with the idea of us having British bills that go further and provide us with extra protection. And in fact, I've been pushing very hard for a digital Bill of Rights that would say what you can and can't do online, that would say that Cameron's idea of banning encryption, banning Snapchat is absurd, and that actually we shouldn't snoop on everything that you do and actually set out principles rather than sort of waiting for things to go on. I know there's a sort of Tory obsession with how evil the European Convention is, which is really bizarre, given that it was written by conservative lawyers after the Second World War so that Europe would live up to our standards of what we thought should be protected. It's really bizarre that we now have a bunch of people saying Churchill's greatest legacy is evil, nasty Europe trying to do things to us. And I really do not understand which sort of rights it is that people are so scared of. We had the latest announcement that the Tories, and they've been quite clear, we agree with Labour on this one actually, but the Tories have been, quite clear that if re-elected, if they get a majority government, they would, for example, take human rights away from terror suspects. Now, one of the key words there is suspects. I have no problem with taking people convicted of terror offences and being quite firm on them. Long prison sentences, it's not a good thing, really bad. But people who are suspects, these are people who might have done nothing wrong at all. So, yes, we should keep that. I also do not understand the antipathy to the Human Rights Act. Because what the Human Rights Act actually does is it says that we can have our courts having a say rather than always waiting for it to be Strasbourg. So, human rights, I used to be on the National Council of Liberty with Shami Chakrabarti. It's something I'm quite passionate about. Yeah.
You've said you don't enjoy being in coalition with the Conservatives, but if the opportunity did arise in May, would you personally like to go back into coalition? Would you go back into coalition with them?
So I personally would like a massive Lib Dem majority government. I think we should. I don't think we should have all the seats. I think that would be quite bad. I want to keep pockets for the others. I wouldn't put that much money on that as an outcome. And it's really tricky. I mean, the thing is, there are things that we agree with the Tories about. For example, one of the first things that we did was to scrap identity cards. That was, clear agreement. That was really easy. Labour fought, tooth and nail to hang on to identity cards, even getting to the stage where they wanted to keep identity cards for people who were transgender who'd been issued with one in the process of their transition, so they could have a passport in one gender and an identity card in the other. Which, okay, sounds vaguely interesting, except for the fact there was only one of these ever issued. And the idea that we would have one valid identity card in this country to whoever it was who didn't want to be outed as trans struck me as a slightly bizarre way to do it. So there are some things where we agree with the Tories, and there are some things where we completely disagree, completely diametrically opposed. Same with Labour. There are some things where we completely agree with Labour. If I'm being more party political, I'd say that's often because they've stolen our policies, but, and I have to say it's wonderful to hear them now in favour of a mansion tax, to hear them now in favour of votes at 16, a whole long list of things which they voted against every time when we suggested when they were with the government. I hope they're genuine about it now because, votes at 16, for example, is something that should happen. It really has to happen. So there are things where we agree and things where we disagree. So it's always going to be tricky. Incidentally, Labour and the Tories agree on a whole lot of things. And there's some things where they disagree. And actually a Labour-Tory coalition would work quite sensibly if our media would explode at the idea because it's it's a bit like two different football teams completely suddenly agreeing to work together in the common good. I don't think we're going to see that tonight at the big game, but so what would I like to see? What I would do is to try to fight for the liberal direction. So we have the Tories who, to my mind, are far too right wing, cause far too much damage. They just are not fair, basically. We have Labour who, well, one of the problems, they just don't get the economy, and they keep messing it up. And actually, it does matter if you add things up, because if you stuff the economy up, if you put people out of work, then you can't be fair, because you don't have money to be fair with, and you've got lots more people unemployed. It's sad but true. I'm centre-left, I'm very, very clear about that, and I'd like Labour to be more successful, but every single Labour government ever has ended up with unemployment higher than when it started. If you're making people unemployed, you can't be doing a fair society. So they would get things wrong. They're also much more authoritarian. They're the most authoritarian party in the Commons. Well, some of the Irish parties are a bit more so. Ian Paisley I have difficulties with. So Tories go far that way, they go too far that way. So what I'd like to see is as much up as possible, as much of that liberal direction. So the coalition, we've got some good things, and we've gone too far to the right. So how can I go straight up? Probably not. So I may have to go up right or up left again. So that would be my personal thing. We did try, incidentally, talking to Labour after 2010. The numbers were really tricky because they didn't really add up properly. It was also quite clear that Labour didn't want to be in government. They were keen to be in opposition. I think they knew how bad things were. But they did make some suggestions. There was a range of policies they wanted as sort of preconditions to talks, which were keeping identity cards, building a new runway at Heathrow Airport, increasing tuition fees. I can't remember what the other ones were. And it was just like, no, we cannot do this. But they didn't want to anyway. I mean, part of the problem was that Gordon Brown clearly would have to go. And the MPs in their negotiating team were all working out who would be the next leader of the party. So, Ed Miliband was there, Dave Miliband was there, Ed Balls was there, and each of them, Harry Harman was there, each of them was more concerned about, can I be leader of my party? And you can't easily run for leader of your party if you're also making coalition deals. So who knows what the outcome will be? I mean, I find it really hard to predict.
But if the opportunity arose, would you go into coalition with the Conservatives again? Personally,
I wouldn't rule out any possible coalition at the moment because I simply don't know. And for example, I think the worst outcome that could have happened given the numbers last time, actually, if we'd had a Tory minority government, they'd have been able to do pretty much anything they want, because what people often don't realise about Parliament is we don't do spending. We do the laws, but we don't control what government itself does. That is the government. Technically we vote every year to agree that however much money can be spent. And it goes through with no debate on the nod. We do not control spending. So the Tories could just have cut most things if they wanted to. They could just have savaged all sorts of expenditure without any vote, without any sort of controls. And they'd probably have then had a snap election and won it. And that, I think, would have been a disaster. So, my dream outcome, I think, sadly, we're not going to have this time. Maybe next time. So I'd be trying to get the best outcome I could. It's a really long answer. I know it's not a firm answer, but there isn't a firm answer there. So, anybody right at the back there? Yeah. I will come to you next.
Nick Clegg's recently quoted as calling Prime Minister's questions farts.
Yeah.
So how effective do you really think Prime Minister's questions is?
Oh, I think Prime Minister's questions is brilliant. You get a whole series of questions saying, would the Prime Minister agree with me that he's brilliant? And then a whole series of questions saying, would the Prime Minister agree with me that he's an idiot? So much of it is such a waste. I think it could be brilliant. The idea that we as MPs every week get to question the Prime Minister. Can you imagine this happening in the US? Obama or Bush having to answer every single week on details of things. It'd be brilliant. But we waste it. It is an awful experience when you're there. It shows people at their worst. Parliament becomes the most tribal it can possibly be. And because of the seating, you're on this side or you're on this side. Incredibly noisy. It goes well over 90 decibels. Often I literally cannot hear what is being said. You can hear it much better on TV because you only get the live microphone. And the amount, the childishness is hideous. And I've been affected by some of it. It moves around. It's an awful experience. There is lots of behaviour from MPs which, if it happened in a place like this, people would be kicked out. I got shouted at one point. There's a Tory MP with cerebral palsy, so he's got a sort of contorted face. And it happens to be Tory, so not a party point. And for a while, every time he got up to speak, there was a group of Labour MPs who would pull contorted faces back at him. And, that's not OK. That's, I hope you would all stand firm against something like that here. That's what happens in Parliament when it gets into that sort of mood. You have comments about, there's a few women, and you can see when they speak, and actually I've seen Tories do this as well, you'll see people going like this at them. It's like, no, you can do, that's not OK. So I think we massively waste what could be a great opportunity. Incidentally, I have a Prime Minister's question on Wednesday. I've actually had one of the highest numbers of Prime Minister's questions of anybody other than Ed Miliband. He beats me out, as does the head of the DUP. But other than party leaders, I think I'm top, or second maybe now. I haven't checked recently. So if you have any suggestion on what I should ask, let me know afterwards or tweet to me or something like that. But it's a great shame the way it works because it could be fabulous. It really could be. I said I was going to take something. Yes. So, are you a student here?
What is the Liberal Democrat stance and your personal view on electoral reform?
We need it desperately. I think we have to have it for a lot of reasons, partly because we have a system that's based on the idea that there are two parties, and we're not in a world where there are just two parties. So Firstpastthepost is a really rubbish system. I think I'd like to see transferable voting. It works for everywhere. Interestingly, every single party in the Commons uses transferable voting for their internal elections. And I have to say the sheer hypocrisy of people saying we shouldn't have transferable voting for the public because it's awful, but of course we'll use it to elect our own leader. You know, Parliament uses it itself. What I'd also like to see a bit more proportionality. So what I'd like to see for the Commons is a multi-member system where you'd have 3 or 4 constituencies elected to get joined, elected 3 or 4 people, and you number your candidates. And that way you're more likely to have a bit more variety. Or, anybody got a guess how many constituencies have had the same party representing them since the war?
Most of them? 200 probably. I know there's one that's been elected, that's the Conservative, that's been held since the Great Reform Act, though.
So 47%. You know, so about half of the country since the war, so over huge change, has had exactly the same party. That means votes in those areas are pretty worthless because it's always going to be the same person. So if you made it better, you'd be able to see, and then if you had 3 or 4 MPs, on this larger area, you'd be able to work out actually that one makes sense, that one's crap. What do you do if you're being discriminated against because you're gay and you want to get help from your MP with something and you know that your MP is one of the ones who still believes it should be a criminal offence? Who vote, there are some who voted against making same-sex relationships legal. How do you go and see your MP about that? You can't compare very easily. So I think that would be much better. I'd also like to do the same thing for local government because we have lots of areas where people vote on a very broad spectrum, but you don't get the outcomes reflected. We ran Cambridge City Council for 14 years. I think we did a great job. And we typically got about 35 to 40% of the vote. We should not be able to get 2/3 of the seats with about 1/3 of the votes. I mean, I'm glad we got them rather than other people, but it's just not right. Cambridge has 42 city councillors, 14 county councillors. One of those is a Tory. The Tories get more than 2% of the vote. It's just not right. So I'd fix that as well. Scrap the House of Lords, make that elected, because it's just horrific that people can be appointed by the Prime Minister or the leader of the parties to be legislators for life. That's awful. We shouldn't have clerics in there by right. There are 3 countries in the world where clergy by right get to be legislators. And it's us, Iran, and the Vatican. Is that really the club that we want to be in? Some of the bishops are very sensible. I don't agree with them on some things, but the idea that they're there by right is just rubbish. I'm trying to work out who's had their hand, so I failed to take. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'd like to ask. So France likes to identify itself generally as a liberal society, but it does ban the wearing of burqas in certain places. In general, do you feel like the Liberal Democrats might do the same in the future?
No, I mean, France is aggressively secularist. So France much more has the view that people should conform. And I don't agree. I don't like burqas. I find it a really unpleasant symbol of the oppression of women. And that's where it comes from. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, I also don't think that I should tell you what you're allowed to wear. And so I would not make things like that illegal, unless there are very specific grounds, so for security purposes, if you have to match with your passport photo, obviously, we have to be able to check. But I would not want to see us going down the role of specifying what people can and cannot wear because of whether we like it or not. Having said that, I would love to see reform in, well, basically every religion, so that it becomes more liberal and more tolerant and stops discriminating between men and women. So, but what do you do about women who can clearly and confidently articulate their desire to be covered up? Should we really make that illegal? We might not agree with their decision, we might not like their decision, but I wouldn't make it illegal. Okay? Yeah. Who else has been waiting? Sorry, you've been waiting for a long time.
What's the exact Lib Dem policy on drugs?
Aha, good. I was hoping somebody would talk about drugs policy. So, well, actually, I mean, we're having a big conference here from the Home Affairs Select Committee, which I sit on, in March. So if a few of you are interested, get in touch and we can find places where Nick will be here to give a big speech, lots of other people. I think we have to... The prohibitionist approach on drugs has been a complete disaster. It has failed completely. What it has done is it has led to fairly high levels of drug use, spent vast amounts of cash, put lots of people in prison, destroyed lots of people's lives, for no benefit whatsoever. If you look internationally, it's fueled huge amounts of crime. The drug cartels make all their money because of what we do, because we have such a stupid policy. So end that. So firstly, immediately end prison sentences for possession. Prison should not... the idea, I won't ask if any of you have ever had a spliff, but perhaps some of you could imagine that you may at some point meet somebody who'd had a spliff, if you can imagine that. The sentence for possession of a single spliff can be up to 7 years in jail. Now, you wouldn't normally get the maximum. But does that feel proportionate? Does that feel right? No, it's absurd. So we'd immediately stop that. One of the key things would be transferring the decisions over drugs policy from the Home Office, who think about policing, who think about what's illegal, to the Department of Health. Because the thing about drugs is that they are harmful. Marijuana is a harmful thing to have. Cocaine's a harmful thing to have. Tobacco, alcohol, heroin, whatever they are, whatever their legal status, they're harmful things. Don't imagine they're safe. But they should be treated as a health thing. So if people are addicted, we should work on how to reduce the addiction and help people to get off it, not lock them up. There's no point. So complete change there. I'd like to, in fact, party policy is to go to the Portuguese system, where possession of any drug at all is not criminal. They have things where you can be sent to addiction treatment, to help and sort of health treatment. What's fascinating in Portugal is that they've taken the money away from locking people up and the whole criminal justice approach and spent it on health to help people get better. And they've seen deaths come down. They've seen usage basically stabilise, it's down among young people. The police say that, then they were opposed to this when it first came in. But we went there with the Select Committee and to talk to them. And they say, actually, it's brilliant because we don't have to waste our time dealing with drug users. Instead, we can use our time dealing with the criminal gangs. And that's what the police should be doing because, associated with drug trade, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of, pretty awful stuff. That's what police should be focused on. So a massive move there. Also keen to see, what was I going to say? Yes, to have a look at what's happening with legal marijuana. So marijuana is now legal in a few countries. Uruguay's done it, I think Ecuador's done it, and a couple of states in the US, well, an increasing number of states in the US, are going for legalised and regulated marijuana markets. I think we should see how those work. There's lots of different models. I think we should find out which, if any, work and then go for that as well. That's party policy. But I don't know which one because they're very different at the moment. The other thing is medicinal cannabis. Cannabis is a fantastic drug to help with a range of things. Multiple sclerosis, some cancers. We should allow people to use it medically. Why would we not? So that's something else which we'd like to see happen. But the current system is just a massive waste of resources. Just one last thing on this. Norman Baker, when he was the minister, in fact, from a report, because we spent a year working on drugs policy, and really interesting to go around and talk to people. And you have, the South Americans saying, please change your approach because you're killing our country. But one of the things we got the government to do was do a study of drugs policy around the world and see what effect it has. The Tories then tried to block it, but we finally managed to get it out. And the conclusion is that drug usage is completely unrelated to how strong your laws are. If you go for relaxed liberal laws, you find the same level of usage as you do if you go for really tough draconian laws. Threaten to lock people up for 20 years or not at all, same usage. So why spend all the money on the prohibitionist things? We've also managed to push people onto taking more dangerous things. If you could get marijuana without legal risk, why would you go for new psychoactive substances, which could be anything? You're having a white powder you know nothing about, which is, most of them are more dangerous, but because they're legal, you'll go for the thing that's legal. So we're persuading people to do more dangerous things rather than less dangerous things. So to me, we should have a policy about drugs of harm reduction. This is what the Lib Dem approach is. If you say, free reign on drugs, have anything you like, that's quite harmful because you'll get some things which will kill you. This ecstasy tablet that's going around, Superman thing, really toxic, it might well kill you. Don't have it. don't have any of them. If we say we'll throw you all in jail if you have them, you massively increase the harm as well. So the lowest harm, for me, is where you actually have an open but regulated system. Okay?
On that bombshell, I think we've got
sorry.
now, so people have enough time to get to lunch.
Oh, sorry.
Please have a round of applause for Dr. Julian.
Thank you. I was hoping to have just, if we can have just 1 minute. I'm sorry for the people I didn't get to speak for. What I would say most importantly, thanks for listening and all that sort of thing. Please follow me, please vote for me, all the rest of it. But whatever, make sure you take part. If you will be old enough to vote, and if you're not, I'm sorry, we'll try and change that. But if you are old enough, and please make sure you've registered to vote, because your say matters. Young people are about a quarter as likely to vote as old people, which is one of the reasons why policies get designed spending lots of money on old people and less money on young people, because people don't vote. So please register, please vote, and please, whatever your party leanings, and don't expect you'll find a perfect party, because, there isn't perfect parties for anybody, think about getting involved with the campaigns. It's a lot of fun, and you can start to really make a difference. There's a young woman called Hannah Thompson, who was a victim of something called revenge porn, where her ex put online photos of her, naked with him and all sorts of other things. Really tough. She was somewhat involved with the Lib Dems, got in touch with me and a few others, and as a result, we've managed to just a couple of days ago pass a law that means that is now illegal, which will protect huge numbers of mostly women, not all women, around the country. She made a massive difference, and you can as well. So please think about it. Get in touch with me if you want to help with me, and I hope many of you would, but get in touch with the others as well. It makes a difference. So thank you very much.